Now that we're outputting a list of tickets here, let's make sure we output more than just this dummy fallback text or that default text for every ticket. And for that, attached you find an updated ticket component HTML file, which you should use to replace your ticket component HTML file with. It's not finished yet, we'll work on it. It contains some dummy code and some placeholders, but it's a starting point. And you should use it to replace your ticket component HTML file so that we can continue working on that ticket component TypeScript file, and we can make sure that we output the actual ticket data there. Now, in that attached ticket component HTML file, you'll see some conditional statements, which at the moment don't contain any real conditions. Instead, this will always be true, for example, which doesn't make too much sense, but we'll work on that soon. I already want to note, though, that @if, just like @for, will only work if you're using Angular 17 or later. In older Angular versions, this would not work, and you would instead have to use the ngIf directive, which I also covered earlier in the course already. I'll not repeat it here, but you should know that this requires Angular 17 or later. Now, with that ticket component HTML file added, we have to make sure that we get the ticket data for the ticket that should be output into that ticket component. Put in other words, we need an input or multiple inputs here. And here I'll actually work with one input, and I'll name it ticket or data. Let's maybe go with data. And you can now either turn this property into an input by adding the @input decorator, or by using the input function. Then you'll get such an input signal, and that's what I'll do here, but you could of course use either approach, as you learned before in the course. Now, I also will set this to be a required input here. And I want to let TypeScript know which kind of data we'll receive here. And here I expect to get such a ticket from my own ticket model. So that interface which we defined there. I expect to get an object of that shape as a required input for this data property on that ticket component. And that then allows me to go to the ticket component HTML file. And then there we can, for example, replace the title here with data executed as a function, since it's a signal, dot title. I'll keep this condition here as it is for the moment, but then further down here, the text should be replaced with some string interpolation where we use data.request. Of course, also executing data here since it's still a signal. And then here for this last if check, I'll check if data.status is equal to open. Because I only want to show this mark as completed button here if it is an open ticket, not one that has been marked as closed. So as completed, you could say. And that's it. Now back in the tickets component HTML file, we should set this data property and bind it dynamically to that ticket which we get here in the loop. So every ticket is passed into its ticket component as a value for this data input. And with that, if I save that and I enter some data here and click submit, you see that's being output here and the title is also being output here, though the styling looks a bit off here. And that's why attached you also find a ticket.component.css file, which you should use to replace your ticket component CSS file with. With that done, if you try this again, the styling should look much better. Please note that clicking this here won't do anything yet though, but we'll soon make sure that these tickets can be collapsed or expanded. But we're outputting the data, and that's looking good. Now we can enhance these tickets further. So I now want to make sure that we can click this button, or actually here this entire title should be a button. And we can click this to collapse or expand the ticket details. To do that, we can go to that ticket component TypeScript file again. And in there, we can add a new property that could be named details visible. And we can either set it to false initially or use signals for managing that state by creating a signal that has an initial value of false. Or true, depending on whether the details should be visible initially. But I'll start with false as an initial value. And I'll use signals here, but that of course is optional. Then I'll also add a method on toggle details where I want to switch from false to true and vice versa. And there are now two ways of doing that. Of course, since I'm using a signal here, I can't just set it to a new value like this with an equal sign. Instead, you learned that you can use the set method to set a new value. And here the new value should be the opposite of the old value. So we could read details visible like this. And as you learned, this won't set up a subscription here. It would only do that inside of the effect function or inside of the template. But here we can read it once like this whenever this method is triggered. And to set details visible to the opposite of what it was, we can add an exclamation mark in front of this details visible. So that way we'll set it to false if it was true and vice versa. That's one way of updating this signal value. An alternative way, which I haven't covered yet, is that you call the update method on this signal. This method works almost like set, but unlike set, it expects to get a function as an argument. And that function will be executed by Angular, and Angular will automatically pass the old signal value as an argument to that function. So I'll name it was visible here, though the name is up to you. And this function then needs to return the new value to which the signal should be set. So in my case, whatever was visible was not, by adding an exclamation mark at the beginning here. That way, if we had true, we'll set false as a new value for details visible, or if we had false, we'll set true as a new value. And that's an alternative way of updating this signal, and it's up to you which approach you prefer. With that, we got that details visible signal here though, and therefore in that ticket component, we can now use that to change the way different things are displayed in that template. To be precise, here for this if statement, I now want to check if details visible is true. And we could do it like this, but since we're using JavaScript, we can also just do it like this, read the value, and if that yields true, that is all we need for this condition. Alternatively, we have this else case here, as you already learned before, or as you already saw before. But then I also have this if check down there, where I also want to check if details visible is true. Because I only want to show that ticket text here if the details are visible. So if I am expanding that ticket. And of course, we must make sure that onToggleDetails now gets called when the user does click some button. So back in the ticket component, here on that button at the top, we should add the click event listener and trigger onToggleDetails like this. Well, and with that, if we save this and we enter some ticket, you see it's not expanded by default, but if I click this, it does expand. So that's now working the way it should, with help of signals, but as mentioned before, you could of course also implement the same functionality totally without signals, as you saw many times before in this course already.